My guest this morning here on Jersey Magazine is Claire Bidwell Smith. She is a therapist who specializes in grief and is the author of multiple books, including her brand new one, Conscious Grieving, a transformative approach to healing from loss. Claire, good morning and welcome to WDHA and WMTR.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
When did you start writing this book?
Oh my gosh, just in the last couple of years. Yeah. I've seen a lot of changes since we went through the pandemic. A lot of new conversations around grief. Obviously, we all experienced grief and loss on such a huge scale, but I started to see how people were beginning to think about grief in a new way and recognize how much of it is with us throughout our lives.
You mentioned COVID, and it's 4 years this week when everything kicked in with the lockdowns and everything. And I'm reminded of about 3 weeks afterwards, the first friend I lost to COVID happened at the very end of the month of March in 2020. He was 30 years old, in the prime of his life, in excellent health. And that was, I think, the first time I thought, boy, this thing may really, really be serious.
Yeah, that is so heartbreaking. I am so sorry.
We each experience grief in different ways. And about 5 years ago, in fact, it'll be five this May, my mom passed away. And when that happened, I said to my kids, I'm not going to post this on social media. I said, this is how I'm going to deal with it. You do what you want. My kids are far more active in social media than I am. So I didn't tell them not to. Like, you do what you need to do here. But in reading your book, I'm wondering, was that me dealing with the loss of my mom, my own personal way of grieving, or was I just delaying the whole process?
No, I think that was your own personal way of doing it. I think that social media is a tricky thing when it comes to grief. Some of us really want to talk openly and publicly about our losses, and others of us feel more private. It's not something we feel ready to share or kind of subject ourselves to commentary or opinions and, experiences like that. I think that you were right in telling your kids, "This is how I'm going to do it. You do it however you like." We all deal with grief in different ways. We all move through it in very different ways.
But reading your book, you have a section on avoiding grief. And as I was reading through that, I'm going, wait a second. Maybe that's what I was doing rather than dealing with it in my own personal way. I was just avoiding the whole thing.
Yeah, I think it's natural to want to avoid it. It can feel so huge, your mother, that the person that you have been with since the day you came into the world. It's a huge loss. At any age, that's a really big loss. And sometimes I think we just aren't sure how to hold that in our lives. And then sometimes people around us aren't able to hold space for it either. And so we're just not sure what to do with it. So we do avoid it. When we avoid it, it can often spill out in anxiety, irritability, anger, just sadness. And so I think when we can make space for it, and making space for it, looks like, doesn't have to be posting on social media. It can look like just spending some time thinking about her, maybe lighting a candle in the evening and just having a moment of reflection, talking about her with your family, writing about her, writing to her. There's so many ways to make space for our own grief.
You mentioned anxiety, and in fact, one of your previous books dealt with anxiety and grief. How are they intertwined?
Again, I think, anxiety can often be the thing that spills out when we are suppressing our grief or avoiding it. But also, we experience anxiety after a big loss because our world changes so much. We ourselves change after a big loss. We may be unsure of how we can expect to show up in our daily lives. I think that most people are really surprised by the enormity of emotion that comes with a big loss, and you may suddenly wonder, can I go to work today and not break down? Can I be with my family and not snap at people? And so often that anxiety will begin to surface of just not really being sure of our landscape now after someone is gone. Not to mention we're confronting our sense of mortality.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it, is dealing with our own mortality. You and I lost our fathers, our respective fathers, at around the same age. I think you were 25.
Was.
And that's the age that I was when I lost my dad, and he passed away very young. And you're dealing with all of that, and then to lose your mom. You lost your mom much younger, at a much younger age than I did. But you deal with those holidays and anniversaries, that year of firsts, and everyone goes through that. And you kind of mentioned this. You referred to it, lighting a candle and things like that. But you offer some very, very interesting ways to honor someone who has passed.
I do. I think, you're right. Those days are so hard. That year of firsts is so hard. The first time you want to call someone and can't, the first time you go through a birthday or a holiday that you always celebrated with them. And so again, taking that time to kind of make space around those events, I think is important. Now, it's also okay to want to close the blinds and just, ignore the day, especially in the beginning. It can be really overwhelming. But I think we can instate traditions that feel really good and healing to us. Maybe you're making your person's favorite dish at a holiday gathering, or maybe you're just setting out a photo of them at a wedding you're attending, or, maybe you're writing them a letter on a meaningful anniversary day and just acknowledging the relationship you had with them. That relationship continues. We have an internal relationship with the people we lose. It could be spiritual, it could just simply be internal. But I think finding ways to honor that relationship and honor the time and the love we had with that person is really important.
One of the things that you talk about in this new book, Conscious Grieving, is giving yourself permission to laugh. Now, growing up in an Irish household as I did, we treated funerals a little differently than maybe some other families did. I remember, and I've told this story on the air a number of times, we were at a funeral for my grand uncle. And I think I was 9 or 10 years old. And I remember saying to my mom, aren't we supposed to be sad that Uncle Jimmy's dead? And she laughed and she said, we're celebrating his life.
Hmm.
But too many times, and that's the typical, what's the difference between an Irish wedding and an Irish funeral? One less person. But so many times we don't give ourselves permission to laugh.
Yeah, I think that's true, but I think it's really important. We can hold multiple feelings when we're grieving. We can hold joy and we can hold sorrow, anxiety, guilt, all kinds of things. There's not just one feeling and one emotion. And I think giving ourselves that permission to laugh, that can be a release too, and it can remind us that we're still here, that there is still life to live. We can celebrate someone's life. We can celebrate the time we had with them. Those things are so important. I think we see a lot of depictions on television and movies of what grief looks like, that you're, shrouded in sorrow in a dark room. And yes, there are absolutely periods of time like that. But then there's also just our regular inherent personalities and life and celebrations.
How does grief transform us?
I think that grief asks a lot of us, but I think that in that ask, there's this opportunity to really kind of discover what matters to us, what we find meaningful, how we want our lives to be meaningful following a loss. So I think that there are ways in which our whole identity can change following a big loss, but that's not always a bad thing. It can feel really painful, the process itself as we go through it. But when we kind of come through the other side, we often find that we've really discovered parts of ourselves we didn't know. We've discovered strength, we've discovered beauty, compassion, so many different ways to transform.
For listeners who want to learn more about you, where can they go?
ClaireBidwellSmith.com. I have a lot of different online programs for grief, multiple books, podcasts, all kinds of information and resources.
And the latest book is called Conscious Grieving, a Transformative Approach to Healing from Loss. Claire Bidwell Smith, thank you so much for your time this morning here on WDHA and WMTR.
Thank you so much for having me.